And finally, the moment you've probably all been waiting for. We're going to be talking about genetic diseases and pedigree charts today, one of my favorite parts of this unit. So we have a few key terms to learn. Like always, it wouldn't be biology without key terms. First is autosomal. Autosomal disorders, or even just autosomal traits in general, these are those that follow Mendel's complete dominance patterns, where the dominant allele always overpowers that recessive allele. So some examples of autosomal disorders or traits are things like albinism, Huntington's disease, sickle cell anemia, and we're going to talk about most of these as we go through this lesson. Autosomal dominant disorders or traits are those where the disease or the trait is linked to the dominant allele. You have no carriers, nobody who's kind of hiding the trait in their genetics that they can pass on to their kids later. In this case, you either have it or you don't. The dominant one means you have whatever the trait is you're looking at. And the recessive allele is the have not. You do not have whatever the trait is that we're talking about. So in this case, if it's the disease or the disorder, anybody who shares even one dominant allele is going to have that disease or disorder. So it's going to be more likely to pass this down if that dominant allele is common in the population. When you have the two little alleles, then you're not going to have the disorder. An example of this is Huntington's disease. So this is a lethal disorder. Lethal meaning it's going to kill you, unfortunately. And with this one, what's happening is your genes, the genes that you inherit result in a disorder that causes your brain to break down. It actually starts to waste away. So you see the healthy brain down on the bottom and the brain with Huntington's disease up at the top, where it actually has a large portion that seems to have degraded over time. Now with this one, you think, well, if the brain is degrading and it's going to kill you, how do you pass this on? Because we, spend 0 to 18 years as children, and most people don't even have children when they turn 18. They wait until their 20s or even their 30s. So how come we don't have more people dying before they pass this on to their children? Well, here's the key reason. You don't develop symptoms until you're much older, 30 to 50 years old. So by that point, you could have had multiple kids that you could have passed this trait onto and not even really known about it. So this is an autosomal dominant disorder, meaning if you have the gene, you get the disease, whether you're homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Another one of these autosomal dominant disorders is dwarfism or achondroplasia. This is where you're going to end up with a person who's much shorter than normal, and they're going to have a disproportionate limb to body ratio compared to what we would call a fully developed human or a normal human. You're born with the phenotype and you stay that way for your whole life. So once again, even if you have just one of those dominant alleles, you're going to end up displaying the dwarfism trait. Then you have autosomal recessive. So remember, autosomal is referring to Mendel's complete dominance. The big A is always dominant over the little a. But in this case, it's the recessive gene, the recessive allele, that's going to be carrying the trait or the disease that we talk about. So in this case, we can get things called carriers. These people will not have the disease. They won't show it outwardly, but they'll be hiding that little allele that they can then pass on to their children or their offspring. So in this case, if you have a big A allele, you're automatically not going to have the trait or the disease. It's only when you have the little a allele that you're going to be diseased. So big A, homozygous dominant, and heterozygous are going to have no outward signs of this disease or this trait. Only the homozygous recessive will show the trait. But we will also have that heterozygous carrier, the one who is carrying it without outward symptoms. So the first example of one of these autosomal recessive traits is albinism. You might have heard of somebody who is an albino. That is what we call people who have this albinism trait. Basically, they do not produce any melanin in their skin, and melanin is what gives us the shades of brown that make our skin. So even in our hair, we produce melanin. If we can't make it at all, we're going to create no pigment. So our skin is going to be very white. Our hair is going to be white. Our eyes are going to be blue or pink. And they're going to be pink because what ends up happening is you only see the blood vessels underneath your eye. So everything is clear because it has no pigment, so you can see all of that nice red blood flowing in your eyes. Now, melanin is the very important protein that protects us from the harmful UV rays of the sun. It sits on top of the nucleus and provides like a little umbrella that covers the nucleus and protects its DNA. So when we don't have melanin, we don't have that protection from those UV rays. So people who are albinos are very sensitive to the sun. They're more often going to have skin cancer problems as a result. But because this is an autosomal recessive trait, you have to have both little alleles in order to display the traits of albinism. A carrier, someone who is heterozygous, is going to appear normal skin. They're going to have normal skin tones. Cystic fibrosis is another disease associated with autosomal recessive traits. And it's unfortunately a lethal disease again. And this is a case where your body's secretions will become abnormally thick. So our body makes secretions as a way to protect us. In our intestines and in our stomach, we produce secretions to protect our intestinal wall and our stomach wall from the harmful acids and enzymes that we produce in our digestive tract. In our lungs, we produce a lot of secretions to catch bad bacteria, and then we cough it up as phlegm, and all that bacteria gets taken out of our lungs where we want to keep them particularly aseptic or clean. Well, with cystic fibrosis, all of those secretions are thicker than normal, so we have a really hard time clearing them, or they don't protect the way they're supposed to. So people with this disease in the past would die very, very young, but now we're seeing common lifespans of 37 to 50 years old, or even older if you have really good treatment. What happens is you'll often get a secondary infection like a pneumonia, and so you'll have to be on a lot of medications to protect your immune system, and you may end up succumbing to one of these secondary infections. Because this is autosomal recessive, you once again have to have both small alleles in order to inherit the trait. You'll be a carrier if you are heterozygous. So you have the ability to pass it on to your kids, but your phenotype is going to be someone who does not have cystic fibrosis. Another one is Tay-Sachs. This is a really, really sad lethal disorder. Basically, there's a buildup of lipids or fats inside the brain. Normally, we want to break these down and keep our brain healthy. But in this case, your body can't do that. So the baby will be born and will live the first few months of his life normally, and then the symptoms are going to begin around age 1. And at this point, we're starting to have a buildup of fat that's going to start causing problems in your brain. So you're going to see the baby not progressing normally in its development. Maybe it's even progressing the wrong way. It's losing developmental skills. And this one's particularly sad because there is no cure, and most children are going to die before the age of 5 who have this. It's very common in Jewish people, particularly those who are of Eastern European descent. So my stepdad had to get tested for this when my mom and my stepdad were planning on having kids because he has that Eastern European Jewish descent. One that's not so sad because it's not lethal is phenylketonuria. And this is where your body can't break down a particular amino acid called phenylalanine. This is commonly put in diet sodas to replace the sugar. It gives us a very sweet flavor. And the disease will end up causing damage to your nervous system, but it's very easily treated. So because we have a treatment for it, we test babies very shortly after they're born. We do a quick little blood stick and we test their blood and see, do they have this trait? If they have the trait, they get treatment and they're good to go. And this one tends to be particularly common in those who are Norwegian or who have Swiss descent. Another one of these autosomal recessive disorders is sickle cell anemia. And we've talked about this one a lot. Normally your red blood cells have that nice circular shape, but with sickle cell anemia, they are sickle shaped. That causes them to create blockages in your blood vessels. They don't carry oxygen as well around your body. So you're going to have the symptoms of anemia. You're going to be really weak. You're going to be tired. You're going to have pain in your joints because of these particular blood clots that like to happen there. So it's a really painful disease that causes you to really have to change the way you live your life. The disease can be severe, or you can have carrier status where you don't have symptoms of the disease. The cool thing about this disease, though, is that we talked about this before, the carriers seem to have protection against malaria. And this is common in people of African descent. So if you live in near the equator of Africa, having protection against malaria is going to be really a huge factor in your survival. So that carrier status is going to be something that is actually a good thing, because a lot of young children will die if they don't get medical treatment from malaria. So this gives you the opportunity to survive, but you now have that unfortunate possibility of passing on that little allele to your child that will end up creating a child with sickle cell anemia if they tend to get it from another parent who has that recessive allele. So let's look at an example problem. If I have an autosomal recessive disorder like albinism, and the mother has it, but the father has a normal phenotype, but one of their children has albinism, what does the dad's genotype have to be and why? So if the child has albinism, that means they have to have the little a genotype, because this is an autosomal recessive disorder. It's passed on by that little a. The mother has it as well. So the mom is also little a. Now the dad is going to have the normal phenotype. So he's going to have at least one capital A, because that capital A is dominant and it's going to protect him if he happens to have a small allele, a little allele, the recessive one. But now, in order for the child to have the same genotype as the mother, it gets one letter from the mom and it gets the second letter from the dad. So if we're looking at how in the world do we make this possible for a kid to get little a, the dad would have to have a heterozygous genotype. He would have to be able to pass on that little a to the child. So the father's genotype would have to be heterozygous, big A, little a, because he has to be able to confer the little allele to his child, but he also has to have the dominant allele to protect him from showing the traits. Let's do another one. What is the probability that a child will be born with Tay-Sachs disease if both of the parents are heterozygous? Heterozygous, remember, is the one where they're different. So if both parents are heterozygous, we can just quickly complete a Punnett square and determine the probability. All three of these have a dominant allele, so those children will not exhibit the disorder because this disorder is recessive. It's going to be tied to having two little alleles. So only one of their possible offspring, these are all possibilities every time they have a child, is going to have the possibility of carrying Tay-Sachs. So it's a 1 out of 4 probability for the ratio, or we can say a 25% probability. So the probability that the child will have it is 25%. Now, we can track specific traits or diseases through families with this really cool chart called a pedigree. We have all these cool symbols, and we turn it into a little family tree with shaded in parts and unshaded parts to represent who has the disorder or the trait and who doesn't. So let's look at each one of these things specifically now. The squares represent males. So this will be a male, a male, male. And the circles represent females. So all of these are females. Empty circles or squares represent someone who does not have the trait, no trait. Completely filled squares or circles are people who have the trait or the disorder or the disease. Half-filled shapes are the carriers. So you might be given a particular pedigree and you'll have to tell me, is this autosomal recessive or autosomal dominant based on how it's passed? You can also look at it and tell me the genotypes of all of the people. Because if this person has carrier status, we know that they're automatically going to be heterozygous. So that can now help me fill in the gaps of what everyone else might be. The people who have the disorder, who are completely shaded in, if it's autosomal recessive, I know that they automatically have to be little a, little a. So from there, we'll be able to figure out every single person or nearly every single person's genotype. Now, horizontal lines like this one, that represents a union or a marriage or a mating, depending on what type of organism you're talking about. And then the vertical line going down is going to represent the offspring of that union. So this particular male and this particular female mated to produce these three offspring. This female then mated with this male to produce two more offspring. So this is going to be generation 1, generation 2, and generation 3. So these might be the grandkids, and these ones are the kids, and these are the grandparents. So you can see how everyone is related. So here's some important rules to figure out, is it recessive, is it dominant, what is going on in my pedigree? So if neither parent shows the trait, your trait cannot be dominant. If it's a dominant trait, then it has to be passed down by the parents. So if you have a trait and neither of your parents have it, it cannot be dominant. Let's look at a genotype example here. If I have a trait and it's dominant, and let's say I'm big A, little a, and I'm looking at my parents, one of my parents had to give me a little a, and the other had to give me a big A. But if both of my parents do not have the disorder, then how can I end up with that big allele? I can't. It's not possible. The only way for a child to have the trait when the parents do not is if it's recessive. So we say that recessive skips generations. Now, if one parent shows the trait, it may be dominant. You may have an instance where one parent is homozygous dominant and the other parent is homozygous recessive. You would then have to look at what is their child or what were their parents to find out, is it a dominant trait or a negative or a recessive trait. If it is dominant, the affected parent can be a heterozygous and the other parent can't carry the trait at all, like this example here. If the trait is recessive, the affected parent would have to be homozygous recessive and the other would have to be a carrier, just like this example here. I would have to have a carrier parent in order to get that particular trait coming up. Oh, this is where one parent also shows the trait, excuse me. And if both parents show the trait, it can be dominant, but you would also have to look at their parents. If their parents don't have the trait, it can't be dominant because of this rule here. If neither parent has the trait, it cannot be dominant. So let's look at an example here. The trait that we're looking at is unibrows, and this is an autosomal recessive. So it's going to skip generations, and the males and females are going to be equally affected. This is going to be important when we talk about X or Y-linked or mitochondrial disorders in a little bit. But if the males and females are equally effective, it's autosomal. It's going to follow Mendel's rules. So in this case, I see this person has the trait, but none of their children do, but then 2 of their grandchildren do. So this is a case of a skipped generation. So it has to be recessive. If I skip generations, if I have a child who has it, but no parent who has it, it has to be a recessive disorder. If it was dominant, one of the parents would have to have it as well. Number 8 or number 9 would have to have it. So now let's look at the individual questions here. How many family members have unibrows? So remember, the filled in circles indicate that they have the trait we're looking at. It's not always a disease. It can be just a regular trait as well. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 family members with unibrows. I like to do this all systematically. I start on this end and work my way down. Then I move to the second row and work my way across. And then I do the same on the last row. That way I make sure I don't miss anybody as I'm going through. Now, how is individual number 15 related to individual number 2? So here's individual number 15, and here's individual number 2. This is going to be grandmother and grandson. So number 15 is the grandson to number 2 because he's a square, and squares represent males and circles represent females. Number 15 has one set of parents before number 2's generation. So it would have to be that number 15 is the grandson of number 2. Now what about, did not pick the eraser on that one. What about the next question? What is the sex of individual number 4? Well, we look at our key and we remember that that means that number 4 is female. And what is the phenotype of number 4? Well, the phenotype is shaded in, meaning they have the trait. So this means they have the unibrow. That's their phenotype. So what would their genotype be? Well, we said this was autosomal recessive, meaning it's linked to the little allele. So their genotype would be little e, little e. Now let's look at people number 8 and 9. Are they homozygous dominant, which would be big E, or are they heterozygous, big E, little e? So number 8 and number 9. Well, there's 2 ways that we could approach this kind of problem. First of all, I know that they have at least one big letter, one dominant allele, because they don't have the trait. They're not shaded in, so that means they do not have a unibrow. But now what is their second letter? That's the key question here. Well, they have 2 children You can always start with the kids. Their kids have unibrows. Some of them do. The only way to get a unibrow is to have two small alleles. That means I have to get one from one parent and the other from the other parent. So I can stop and safely say that both of them have to be big E, little e. They have to be heterozygous for this trait. But let's say you didn't look at the kids first. Let's say you went the opposite direction. You went and looked at their parents. Well, in both cases, they had a parent who had the trait. Those parents were little e, little e. This means the only letter that these parents could give was a little e. So both of these people have to have a little e hidden in their genotype. So either way you slice it, you're going to end up with a heterozygous genotype. And what is the genotype of person number 2? That's our very last question. So let's erase all this nonsense here. Number 2, what is their genotype? Well, we see that none of their kids have a unibrow. And we see that he's not shaded, or she is not shaded in. So this woman does not have a unibrow herself. So she's going to be carrying at least one dominant allele. We have to figure out the second one. We know that this father is little e, little e. So all of the children are going to be carrying one little e and one big E. So we know that they got a big E from their mother. But we don't know if that means that she has two big E's or a big E, little e. In this particular case, you're actually not going to be able to give me the one perfect answer without seeing more information. We would have to see her parents or her siblings to be able to figure out for 100% sure what hers is. Now, most likely we can say that she's dominant, homozygous dominant, because how can you get 4 children with big E's every single time if you have a hidden little allele? The odds are really small, but they're not 0. So in this case, their genotype could be big E, or big E, little e. We don't know for sure. Now let's look at this one. I am telling you that it's an autosomal dominant disorder. So the way I like to approach these problems, if they tell me that it's dominant or recessive, I automatically want to go and start filling in some of this missing information. If it's dominant, that means I'm going to see the trait with people who have any combination of a capital letter. The empty letters are going to be recessive this time because these people, or the empty shapes are going to be recessive because these people are not carrying the trait. All of these other people will have at least one big A because it's a dominant trait. I can't fill in other information just yet. But now this is asking me, how can I tell that this is an autosomal dominant trait? If I didn't give you that information, how would you be able to figure it out yourself? Well, let's see. I have this person, number 9, who has it, and they have at least one parent who has it. Number 5 and number 6 have it, and they have at least one parent who has it. So automatically I'm thinking dominant here. Now, these offspring who do not have the disorder, none of their kids do either. So there's a really good bet that it's not recessive at this point, because otherwise, if it was recessive, they could have silently been carrying that, especially number 7 here. Number 7 has 2 parents who are affected. So their likelihood of carrying that recessive allele, if this was a recessive disorder, is pretty high. So we may have seen their kids with the disorder. So this is an autosomal dominant disorder. Now let's do the second question, which is figure out all of the genotypes of the individuals and list them underneath their shape. Well, we've already done that for most of them. We just need to figure out the last few. So the way I like to start this now is look at the people who have kids that are different than them. In this case, number 1 and number 2 have child number 7, who is little a. The only way that they could have gotten 2 little alleles is if each parent gave them one. So automatically we know that number 1 and number 2 are little a, big A. We see that the same thing is here with number 8. Number 8 has 2 little alleles. They had to get one from parent number 3, which makes sense, but they had to get the other from parent number 4. Then I'm going to move over here to number 9. I could move to 5 or 6, but 9 is a little bit easier to do first. 9's parents are 3 and 4. 4 gave number 9 the dominant allele because number 3 has no dominant allele to give. So number 3 is going to give the little a, no matter how you slice it, to number 9. Now number 5 and number 6, if we do a Punnett square based on their parents' genotypes, both of the parents were heterozygous. So I could end up with any mix of the genotypes. We know it's not little a because then they would have been an empty shape just like their brother. So they could be big A, or big A, little a. This is another one of those cases of I don't know for sure, so you'll have to put both down. Let's do another practice here. How many males have attached earlobes? I want you to answer this one first before we go over it. So look at this pedigree and tell me how many males have attached earlobes. Well, our males are squares, and the males with the trait that we're looking at are shaded in because it says male attached earlobes next to our shaded in key. So all I have to do is come over here and check how many shaded in males I have, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The second question, is this autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive, and how do you know? Take a moment and answer that question for yourself, and then we'll go over it together. So this is going to be an autosomal recessive trait. And how do I know that? Well, from that cardinal rule number 1 that we went over. If you look at number 1 that I left circled in, number 1 has 2 parents that are unaffected. If this was dominant, number 1 would have to have a genotype of either big A, little a, or big A, big A. That would mean one of their parents has to have a big A in their genotype in order to pass it along as well. So their parent would be shaded in. They would have to have the disorder as well if this was dominant. So automatically I know that this cannot be a dominant trait. It has to be recessive just from that one key piece of information. So in this case, I'm going to have the shaded in people with little a. So that way the 2 parents can pass on that hidden little allele to their offspring. So you can see here that we don't always look at the carriers and shade them in halfway. Sometimes you're going to be given a pedigree that wants you to figure out who the carriers are for yourself. Another way that I can tell that this is autosomal recessive is that there is no one with the disorder in generation 2. They have a child, or I'm sorry, generation 1. They have a child with the disorder in generation 2, but then that person has some children with no trait in generation 3. So it's skipping over these particular children. So let's learn about a few more interesting genetic disorders or genetic traits. The first one is Down syndrome. Another term for this is trisomy 21. We are going to have an extra copy of the 21st chromosome when we have a patient with Down syndrome or a person with Down syndrome. And this causes some mental deficiencies. It causes a different shape to the face, and it's not lethal, but sometimes people with Down syndrome can have shorter lifespans. This is one of those situations where there's a big spectrum on what your abilities are if you're born with Down syndrome. Some people need care for most of their life. Other people with Down syndrome get jobs and have families of their own. They tend to be shorter than normal. And it's more common to have a child with Down syndrome if the mom is over 40. This is because of that one little weird fact that we've been carrying around our eggs for our entire lives. The first part of egg creation or oogenesis happens when you're an embryo in uterus, but you don't finish it until you actually ovulate and then have an egg get fertilized. So all of those eggs that you've been living with your whole life are damaged by excessive radiation from the sun or physical damage or other types of chemical mutagens, things that can cause mutations. And you're more likely to end up with this particular case. Then there are X-linked diseases. So our chromosome number, or our chromosome pair number 23, is either going to be an XX or an XY, and that's going to confirm your sex at birth. If you have an XY, you are a male. If you have an XX, you are a female. Now, when we do a Punnett square, you'll see that the odds of having a boy or a girl based on the Punnett square is always 50%. And the key thing with these Punnett squares is you have to do a new Punnett square every single time that you're going to have another child. So it's not, oh, well, I have 2 kids, one is a boy, that means the next one has to be a girl. No, I'm flipping that coin. I'm doing that Punnett square every single time I have a child. So there's a 50-50 chance of a boy or a girl every single time you will reproduce. But now the X chromosome, this one has some very important information that is not linked to your sex. With males, this Y chromosome, its sole purpose is essentially to make you male. The X chromosome has other information on it, so we can end up with disorders linked to the other genes on our X chromosome. You cannot live without at least one chromosome. So if you were to have a mutation where you were only born with a Y, you would not survive that pregnancy. Your mom would either have a miscarriage or you wouldn't even develop normally at all, and the egg would just pass. Now with these X-linked diseases, one way you can get them is through something called non-disjunction. This is where something is going wrong during gamete formation or meiosis. For some reason, one of our homologous pairs did not separate properly. Instead of them going into different cells the way they're supposed to, they got grabbed by the same side. So one of my cells had too many, and the other one had none. So this can end up with really interesting cases like 2 X's and a Y, or 3 X's, or 1 X and 2 Y's. There's a lot of different genetic disorders that can pop up. The first one that we'll talk about is Turner syndrome. This is where only 1 X is given to the child. We end up with a non-disjunction where we're missing some information in one of our eggs. So the person only has 1 X and then nothing else in the second spot. So this person will develop as female, but they're not going to have ovaries. So they won't be able to have children of their own. They're going to be short. They're probably going to have larger hands and feet. They may even have a shorter neck that has a webbing characteristic to it, like this young girl in the picture. You can also have triple X syndrome, where you have an extra X chromosome instead of just the typical XX. Now, most women with this disease aren't diagnosed with it because there's not a lot of differences that can be seen. So the symptoms aren't really obvious. Sometimes they might be taller than normal. Sometimes they might have a learning disability like dyslexia. They may have weaker muscles, but you won't be able to tell just from looking at them. When a male has too many X's, though, there are some hidden small symptoms or characteristics that can possibly tell you what's going on. These men are going to be sterile. They won't be able to have kids of their own. They will develop as men, though, because they have a Y chromosome. Even if you have a little sliver of a Y chromosome, you are almost always going to develop as a male outwardly. You might be very tall. You might have weaker muscles or poor coordination or less body hair. But you're not going to start seeing these until after puberty. If you see them at all, you may not have such striking characteristics to give you a hint. Now, the symptoms are going to be much more severe the more X's you have. So if you have 3 X's and a Y, then you're going to have very severe symptoms. There is a rumor or a theory out there that George Washington had Klinefelter syndrome, mostly because he was so tall for men of that time and he wasn't able to have children of his own. Another X-linked disease is color blindness. So because it's X-linked, it's going to be more common in men than women. So if you are a woman and you have 2 X chromosomes, you can have the healthy version of the color seeing gene, or you might have an unhealthy and a healthy version, or you can have 2 unhealthy versions. Only when you have 2 X's with the colorblind gene will you be colorblind yourself. If you're a male, the odds are a little less in your favor. So you wouldn't want to be in Panem fighting the Hunger Games, that's for sure. In this case, you either have the healthy or the unhealthy. You don't have that option of the protection of that heterozygous matchup. So that's why it tends to be more common in men. Even if they inherit just one, they're going to show the symptoms of this disorder. So here are 3 color blindness tests. You've got some green dots with a red number 29 right in the middle there. If you're colorblind, if you're red-green colorblind, you won't be able to see that 29. On this one here, it's green with a red 56, but you won't be able to see that if you are colorblind. And on the very last one, there is an 8 right there. Now, these X-linked disorders have really fascinating pedigrees. Like I said, the males are going to inherit the trait more. So on this particular pedigree, I only have males who have the full disorder. The females are carriers. I don't see a single, I do see a single female with the trait, but only one. So I have significantly more males with the trait than females. Only the females can be carriers. Males cannot carry because they only have the healthy version of the X or they have the unhealthy. They either have the disorder or they don't. Now, any male who is affected is going to pass it on to all of his daughters. That's because in order to have a daughter, you have to have the father pass on his X. The mom has to give the other X. So his X has to go to his daughters. So all of his daughters are going to be carriers or heterozygous. Because this is also a recessive trait, you're going to see those skipped generations. Maybe you see a boy who has it when neither of his parents did. So you will see the same things that follow recessive patterns. Another X-linked disorder is hemophilia, and this is an X-linked recessive where you're going to have problems with blood clotting. You won't be able to clot your blood normally. So cuts will either take a very, very long time to form, or you're not really going to catch it in time and you can bleed out. So bruises aren't just, oh, I have a bruise, it's no big deal, but that can be a sign of massive internal bleeding that's going on that cannot be stopped because you form clots inside your body, not just when you have an external cut. Now this one is really interesting because it's very common in the royal families of Europe. If we look at this pedigree here, we can see right around the late 1800s, early 1900s, we saw this hemophilia popping up with a lot of boys in the European royal families. And it all seemed to stem from Queen Victoria, who most likely developed this as a mutation. So she probably had a spontaneous mutation occur because before that, there was no history of hemophilia in her family. So it is possible for you to get a mutation that gives you a different allele. So if her parents both were homozygous dominant, she could end up with a heterozygous genotype if she had a spontaneous mutation occur. And it's really interesting because it is this disorder that ended up bringing Rasputin into the royal family of Russia because the Tsar's son had hemophilia and he needed help from a doctor, so they hired Rasputin, who had some medical knowledge, and he became a big advisor to the family. You also have Y-linked disorders. These are very, very rare, but only males can get the disorder because it's linked to the Y chromosome. Women do not have Y chromosomes, so they won't be able to carry these disorders. No carriers at all because you either have a Y chromosome or you don't. There's no carriers, just like with males, how they only have one X, so they can't be a carrier of a disorder. The key thing with recognizing this one is that only males will have it, and fathers will pass the trait on to all of their sons because they have to give that Y chromosome in order to create a son. So in every single generation, you'll see that all males of a family will have the disorder. And the very last one we'll talk about now are mitochondrial diseases. So going back way to the beginning of the school year, remember that mitochondria have their own DNA. It's completely separate from ours, and that's because of that theory of endosymbiosis, where we believe that our cells swallowed up these tiny prokaryotic cells that eventually we learned to live in harmony with them. We became symbionts with them. Now, sometimes this DNA in the mitochondria has its own mutations that are separate from your genetic mutations in your DNA. So even though it's just your mitochondria that have a mutation, the result is disease in the person who has that diseased mitochondria. Now, the cool thing with these ones, how will I know that it is a mitochondrial disorder? It is only passed on from the mother because we only give mitochondria in our eggs. The sperm do not give mitochondria. They only give DNA. So they won't be passing on any mitochondria that could possibly be disordered. And you'll notice that every single one of her children will end up with the disorder. So this mother has it and gave it to all of her children, but it's passed on by the mother. So in this case of this family on the bottom right, the father has it, but none of the children do because he does not pass on any mitochondria. All right, I hope you enjoyed that, and if you have any questions, just let me know.